Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of SAP's CodeTalk. I'm your host today, and I'm joined by a friend, a colleague. Our guest is Riley Rainey, and if you don't know Riley, I'm going to let him introduce himself now. Riley, how you doing?
Hey, Josh. Always good to see you. Um,
Good, thanks.
so I work inside the developer relations team, which is maybe a slightly bigger scope than developer advocacy in general, which of course is Josh and Tom Young and all of that team doing the good work that they do. I spend a little bit more of my time talking about the kinds of topics that y'all talk about externally, internally. And that means educating people about what we do over here in community related to developers. And maybe closer to the topic that we're going to talk about today, how do we understand developers better? And what's our point of view about what developers are up to in the SAP ecosystem? And what kind of information can we deliver internally that's going to help people connect with developers more effectively?
So look, we're 110,000 employees in this company, and I'm amazed when I walk into the Newtown Square office and they go, "What team are you on? What do you guys do?" So can you set the stage then? You mentioned kind of spilling the beans a little bit early, like you've been talking today about the survey. What's the title of the survey and how did it get started?
Yeah. So the name of it, of course, is the SAP Developer Insight Survey. And the SAP part, like it implies, is we always want to understand who our audience is better in any context. We work with developers, so that applies to developers too. And we could see doing research in the industry, there are plenty of developer surveys out there run by industry analysts, other companies that have developer forums and whatnot. And we looked at those 5 years ago when we were first getting started with this. We could see that there's a lot of useful information out there, but we also saw that there's a lot of unique characteristics about the SAP ecosystem beyond just the ABAP language and things like that. There's a number of things that lead to interesting questions that just generic surveys are not going to give people the answers to. So that's where we decided to create our own survey. And the original plan, we didn't necessarily say that we were going to run this every year, but we've started doing that. And it's gone for 5 years running. We run it basically in the January, February timeframe, but there's a lot of planning that goes into that too. So anyhow, we've built up with 5 years of data some interesting trends, and we always ask other questions every year. But that's the basic idea, and the whole thing here. And I think maybe another point of this is, as we were looking at this and looking at the kinds of questions that we would ask, we realized pretty early that this wasn't going to be just valuable to us internally inside SAP. We could take the survey and we could lock it up and nobody ever see what the results are. But it's, I think, very much tradition for us that this is a give back to the community. So every year that we run this, every year that we've run it in the past, we do an external report as well as all the internal findings that we put together. And there's really not much difference between the internal and the external report, in truth. But we want to give people, whether it's a partner trying to understand the ecosystem better, a customer understanding what they're up to and how it compares to other people, or even individuals, what technology is hot and what should you learn next, those kinds of things. I think there's all pieces of information inside the report that we put out that might be valuable to people in that context.
Yeah, and before we get to the report and dig in, you just reminded me that one of my common things I give in speeches is, what code should I learn? I get asked that by a lot of the younger people. They come up and they're starting their career, they're either in university or it's their first job, and what should I learn? And I learned through going to India last year that each region really is expecting a different answer. Some people care about it because they enjoy coding and they want to make a difference with the code they enjoy. Other people want to do things that are going to get them a better job. They'll actually work in a language they hate just to get career and performative results. And then they'll expand upon that. And then other people, they actually want to build something using a certain kind of code. It's the only kind of code that can make it happen. And so they come to us, and as SAP, we are one of the industry leaders. So I'm curious if you can dive in then, like what kind of findings did you get and how did you break those apart inside the survey?
Yeah, that kind of brings up a point or a story about how we got to the questions that we asked today. We started out with 5 years ago with not necessarily scattershot questions, but we went in a lot of directions that we don't go today. And one of the directions that we have evolved a lot revolves around technology and what technology people are using. So one question that's been throughout all of this is, in the last 12 months, what languages have you used, right? Because we realize people are a lot of times polymaths these days and polyglot. And so we ask a question in there, and you've got everything in there from, Go and R to ABAP, and ABAP dominates that. But then as we looked at the results years ago, we realized that doesn't tell all the story because, for example, if somebody says, yeah, they use JavaScript, okay, okay, was that a front end or a back end? Was that, and if it's a front end, was that UI5 or something else, Angular? What was it? So a couple of years ago, I think 3 years ago, if I remember right, we started asking, okay, well, what frameworks do you use? And we had separate questions for front end and back end. So there's data in the survey that shows like relative popularity or relative use of not just JavaScript and TypeScript, but UI5, Fiori Elements, Open UI5, all the way down to open systems, non-SAP specific systems. And same thing on the back ends too. So we can see not only do you have ABAP being very popular, but you can also see the distinction now between ABAP Cloud and ABAP Standard. Or in the case of CAP, is it CAP Java or is it CAP JavaScript? Right, there's differences there, and there's interesting differences in the data that we came out with, by the way. But then this year, the first time we asked a question going even deeper still into that of, okay, we know that, of course, applications are SAP's bread and butter, and for developers, extending those applications is what we do, what they do. So asking about environments, about how people are extending and what they're doing. We had a very specific question in there, and we haggle about how to formulate any of these questions that we asked. But what we intentionally did is said, okay, for the last project that you worked on, what was the infrastructure architecture that you used? And it could have been, I did it on stack, traditional old style ECC, or it might have been embedded steampunk in that kind of a context, or they could be using BTP and side-by-side extension architecture. And what came out of that was some interesting points. I mean, clearly, on stack is very popular still, and we know from the lineage of this survey that our existing audience is very, very important. Not everybody is using all the absolutely most modern tools, because not every company has evolved to the point where they're really doing that yet. And so anyway, you can go to the survey and you can see the results there, but it points out, for example, one of the unexpected things that was in that particular question is a full 10% of the people who answered the question said 10% of those projects were actually using low code, no code, using SAP build low code, no code stuff. And we know that, of course, there's a lot of heat and light around low code and no code and the promise for doing that and expanding the envelope in terms of who can develop apps and that sort of thing. And that's all valid. But when it comes right down to is it being actually used in real life? And the answer is yes. And that was not something that we went into the question hoping that we were going to see. But it was, made us smile to see the answer.
Yeah. So I'm just going to ask this, and if you don't have a good answer to it, and if you can't share, but you say we haggled. Who's the we? Who's haggling over forming this?
So we run the survey January, February, but basically around the time frame of Tech Ed, just by coincidence, which is November-ish, we put together a group, and it's sort of an open invitation inside SAP. Anybody who's interested will generally invite to these meetings. And the way that we do it is everybody introduces themselves, and then we sit down and we talk about last year's survey and the lineage of data, things that we know that we're looking for trends on. But then we sort of open up the floor to say, okay, what are you looking for that we don't have in the survey today? And we identify major topic areas, that we're going to ask questions about. And then we get down to that haggling that I was talking about. Okay, how should we phrase this question? Right. Are you just asking for general insight? Are we looking, like in the context of that particular question, we could have said, what's your favorite? Right. But if the nature of the question is you're trying to get to what's actually being used versus what people like, you're going to have to ask that question in a different way. Right.
Okay.
So that's where that comes into. And it leads to lots of interesting discussions. And we have teams that have been involved in this survey for 3 or 4 years running now. And that's actually what I think one of the interesting parts of the survey too, is that it becomes, the survey isn't just a be all end all. It's not just, okay, here's the report and you're done. It's a conversation starter. It really is a question of who is it that we have in the community? What are they doing? And what's going to be important to them?
Okay. So I got to ask then, like, this is, we play buzzword bingo and we rename our products all the time, but what is the chunk of the survey dedicated toward AI? Like, how much of it was around that? How much of that was a debate before you released it?
Well, so we were honestly in an interesting position because of the announcements with that were in that tech ed timeframe around generative AI for developers. We actually had the build code. I can't remember the technical term for it, but a limited preview that folks could sign up for in the tech ed timeframe. So we were. I guess the question that we had there is we always want the widest possible audience here. So in this particular survey, it would have been inappropriate for us to just say, "Oh, well, did you do the build code preview and tell us what you think about that?" Because you're narrowing down to a very small group, and that's surveys are always a numbers game when you're talking.
Growing up in the South, we refer to that as a baited field. So
there you go. Yeah. What we chose to do in our talking through that process was actually come up with the list of generic categories of possible technology areas that generative AI might help a developer, and then ask questions about each one of those. Is it something that you know about and you think is going to be useful? Is it something that maybe you've looked at a product already and maybe it's not an SAP product, but we're curious what's out there always? So that was one of the answers. Another one was, I'm already using this in a productive environment, right? And one of the categories included code completion. So there's lots of tools out there that have that kind of a capability today without necessarily being branded as this is generative AI based, but it's very similar technology, or even that's the underlying technology with that. So anyway, there were probably a dozen categories. And again, you can go back to the report and see the answer. I think for this year's timing of that, I wouldn't say that we got a lot of conclusive results.
Okay.
One area, and just to put it out there, one of the areas going into that I was curious about was greenfield versus brownfield.
Okay.
There are topic areas, for example, refactoring code, refactoring existing code, migrating existing code. Those kinds of topics might be very interesting in the world of SAP, right? For obvious reasons. Building new applications is always important when you're talking about app dev, but it's not something that somebody does every day. So one place where we actually looked at the list of questions is categorizing those as that new code versus old code sort of aspect of each particular category. And what I was hoping to see, honestly, was, okay, well, maybe there's more interest in one or the other. But the point is, it really didn't show in the data.
Okay.
And then you kind of sit back and say, okay, well, why is that? And I think it's hard to come up with a conclusive response, right? We are forward leading into these questions. We're asking hypotheticals in some cases. So how much are you going to bank on the actual answers that we got? So
yeah, we talked about something like JavaScript. Like, I remember when I was dealing with an industry term that was being invented, because we had a different style of server-side JavaScript, and we needed to come up with a name for that category. And it's we're driven sometimes by the analyst driving us to a bucket, and then that bucket gets measured. And then if people don't use it, they put us into a new bucket. And in the end, it's about what you said in the very beginning, which is we have a lot of SAP developers that are solving these business problems using a lot of code in our own stack. So, all right, we're getting low on time. Any other overall comments before I ask you one final question?
Well, one thing that I would point out, and take a look at developer roles within there, right? This is a developer survey. We try to attract people who are professional developers to this in the way that we advertise for it and things like that. So it's not the whole community, but within that group of developers, you've got different flavors, different tasks and roles that people perform. And one of the things that we've seen that we are acting upon sort of as we're talking right now is the increasing prevalence of architects out in our ecosystem. We've gone from 3 years ago, essentially, I think like 20% of the audience said, I did something related to app or solution architecture in the past 12 months. This year, it was 44%. And I think what that speaks to is, and there's a very identifiable trend line there. And I think what it speaks to is just the idea that as people move to the cloud, you have a richer set of choices, understanding the different options that you can work with to do solutioning means that people spend more time thinking about that. And this is something that we're baking into our learning. I think some of our programs that you've probably seen in other code talks and things like that, talking to people like Kevin and other folks, just talking about architecture in general and how it's applied, especially in BTP, is something that we're talking more and more about. And that, gets back to the BTP guidance framework too, is something that people should be looking into, because there's just a lot of good information that's there, and it's growing every day.
Yeah, and that was one of the questions that you had in the survey, is how many people know about the guidance that's been put out by the BTP team.
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't know about that today, and we'll drop a link, I think, in the Code Talk, we can do that so people can go to it. Go to that BTP guidance framework, the BTP developers guide within there. Like you're pointing out, we only had, I think, of course, we're running this survey just a month or two after TechEd, but we announced that at TechEd, and still only half of the developers who took the survey even knew that it existed.
Yeah, I mean, I remember there being the QR code at the TechEd announcement on the screen. You could literally go to it right there and sign up, and it might have been overwhelmed at the time with people all hitting it at the same moment, but we just need more people to know they can go there, and that's a living, breathing document too. But okay, so I have one question before we'll put links into the 2024 survey report, and I think you have some 2023 other information we can tag and put down.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to ask you, is this limited to only certain kind of people, or when you open this up next year, are you asking for respondents inside of SAP or publicly? I wanted that to be clear to the audience.
So we do the survey in a way that includes SAP employees. And that's part of the data set that we keep internally, just because we don't think it's necessarily relevant externally. We let people fill out the survey regardless of their employment status or background. But we do ask, are you working for a partner? Are you working for a customer? Or are you something else, including SAP employee? And we intentionally narrow down the survey results that we report on pretty early in that the sequence of what we show in the report, to only focus on the external community, because we know that we would skew, our choice of languages and technologies is going to skew things. This is more about what the community is up to.
So to those outside of SAP, when you see this come out again, when Riley is promoting this, again, you're going to be talking about this later this year at TechEd, promoting it for people to. So when is the next potential survey coming out? That's the final bullet I want to get from you.
Yeah, so we run this January, February every year. We'll do this again next year. We look for it then. We'll advertise it on social media, and the external report comes out in the March or April timeframe.
I just had a little bit of pain inside when I just realized it's going to be 2025 next year.
I know.
I can't believe we're going to be in the year 2025.
2010 was the year we made contact, right?
Yeah, exactly. Cool. All right. Lots of great information. Anything else to add before we say goodbye?
No.
All right.
Take a look at the report, though. We'll drop the link, and any conversation you want to have about that, reach out to us.
Definitely. There'll be tons of links, like I said, at the bottom of this code talk, and then you guys can dialogue with us on social media. Hit us up directly on LinkedIn, private messages, whatever. We'll get back to you. So thanks so much. Probably hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Well, Josh, thanks.
Bye.